The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B creaked open, and Amelia Brooks stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She wore a simple navy dress and clutched a worn leather purse, looking every bit like the quiet housewife everyone believed her to be. Her beautiful dark skin seemed to glow under the courthouse lights, but her brown eyes held a sadness that 3 years of marriage had carved deep into her soul. Derek sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit making him look like the successful businessman he pretended to be. Next to him sat Rebecca, his sister, her red hair cascading over her shoulders as she whispered something in Derek's ear. They both turned to look at Amelia as she entered, and Rebecca's lips curved into a cold smile. Amelia's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was a kind older man who specialized in simple divorce cases. He'd warned her that Derek's team was aggressive, that they were claiming she was mentally unstable and unfit to receive any assets from the marriage. She nodded and took her seat, expecting the worst. After all, Derek and Rebecca had been planning this for months. They had witnesses ready to lie about her behavior. They had forged medical documents claiming she needed psychiatric care. They were going to take everything and leave her with nothing. "All rise," the bailiff called. The Honorable Judge Coleman presiding. Judge Coleman was a distinguished African-American man in his 60s, known throughout the state for his fair judgments and stern demeanor. His graying hair and deep-set eyes gave him the look of someone who had seen every kind of human behavior cross his bench. He was Derek's choice. They'd specifically requested him, thinking he'd be sympathetic to Derek's claims about having an unstable wife. As Judge Coleman settled into his chair and opened the case file, his eyes swept across the courtroom in his usual manner. But when his gaze landed on Amelia, something unexpected happened. The file slipped from his hands, papers scattering across his bench. His mouth opened slightly and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. "Your Honor?" Derek's attorney, Mr. Harrison, looked confused. "Are you all right?" The entire courtroom had gone silent. Amelia felt everyone's eyes on her, but she was staring at Judge Coleman in confusion. Why was he looking at her like that? Like he'd seen a ghost? Judge Coleman slowly gathered the scattered papers, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, but his eyes never left Amelia's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Could the defendant please state her full legal name for the record?" Mr. Peterson stood. "Your Honor, my client is Amelia Brooks, married name from her union with the plaintiff, Derek Brooks." "And her maiden name?" Judge Coleman's voice was stronger now, but there was something strange in it that made everyone lean forward. "Amelia Mitchell, Your Honor." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek and Rebecca exchanged confused glances, while Mr. Harrison looked irritated by the delay. But Judge Coleman's expression had changed completely. His eyes were wide with recognition and something that looked almost like fear. "Mitchell," he repeated slowly. "And your father's name, Miss Brooks?" Amelia felt her heart begin to race. This was not supposed to happen. She had left that life behind 3 years ago when she decided to disappear into a simple existence as a bookkeeper in this small city. No one was supposed to know who she really was. "Your Honor," Mr. Harrison interrupted, "I fail to see how the defendant's family history is relevant to these proceedings." Judge Coleman turned his sharp gaze to the attorney. "Mr. Harrison, I will determine what is relevant in my courtroom. Ms. Brooks, please answer the question." Amelia stood slowly, her legs feeling weak. Derek was staring at her with growing confusion and something that might have been worry. Rebecca's confident smile was beginning to fade. "My father is Thomas Mitchell," Amelia said quietly. The few people in the gallery gasped. Mr. Peterson's mouth fell open. Derek's face went white, and Rebecca grabbed his arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Judge Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying Amelia with new eyes. "Supreme Court Justice Thomas Mitchell." It wasn't a question. It was a statement that hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Derek's attorney was shuffling through his papers frantically, probably wondering how he'd missed something so important. Rebecca looked like she might be sick. "Your Honor," Derek's voice cracked as he spoke, "there must be some mistake. My wife is just a bookkeeper. She doesn't have any family money or connections. She told me her parents died when she was young." Judge Coleman's expression was unreadable as he looked between Derek and Amelia. "Mr. Brooks, it appears there are many things about your wife that you don't know." Amelia closed her eyes briefly, knowing that her carefully constructed simple life was about to crumble. But as she opened them again and saw the panic beginning to set in Derek and Rebecca's faces, she realized that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The most powerful legal family in the country. That's who they'd decided to steal from and destroy. And they had no idea what was coming for them. The coffee shop on 5th Street was busy that Tuesday morning, filled with the usual mix of business people grabbing their morning caffeine fix and students with laptops spread across small tables. Amelia sat in the corner, her accounting textbook open beside her laptop as she worked on client files for the small bookkeeping firm where she'd found employment. She had been living as Amelia Mitchell for 6 months now, having legally changed her name back to her maiden name after leaving her father's world behind. The expensive clothes, the high-profile social events, the constant pressure of being Justice Thomas Mitchell's daughter, she'd walked away from all of it after the tragedy that had torn their family apart. Her younger brother Samuel had been killed in a car accident while driving home from one of their father's political events. He'd been drinking, trying to cope with the pressure of being a Supreme Court justice's son, and he'd wrapped his car around a tree on a rainy night in October. Amelia blamed herself for not seeing how much he was struggling. She blamed her father for putting so much pressure on both of them. Most of all, she blamed the whole system that had made their family's private pain into public news. So she disappeared. She moved to a small city 3 hours away, took a job doing books for local businesses, and tried to build a quiet life where nobody knew who she was or where she came from. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Amelia looked up to see a tall, good-looking white man with sandy brown hair and kind blue eyes. He was holding a coffee cup and looking a bit embarrassed as he gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Oh no, go ahead," she said, closing her textbook and making room. "Thanks. I'm Derek, by the way. Derek Brooks." "Amelia," she replied with a small smile. "Nice to meet you." They talked easily for the next hour. Derek explained that he was new to the city, having moved here to start a business consulting firm. He was charming and funny, asking her about good restaurants and places to see in town. When Amelia mentioned that she worked as a bookkeeper, Derek's eyes lit up. "That's perfect. I'm going to need someone to help me with the financial side of getting my business started. You wouldn't be interested in taking on a new client, would you?" Over the next few weeks, Derek became a regular part of Amelia's life. He hired her to help set up his business books, and they met several times a week to work on his finances. He was grateful for her help, always bringing her coffee and making her laugh with stories about his attempts to navigate starting a business. "I have to admit something," Derek said one evening as they finished working on his quarterly projections. "I've been looking forward to these meetings for more than just the business advice." Amelia felt her heart skip a beat. It had been so long since anyone had shown genuine interest in her, and Derek seemed so different from the men in her father's political circles. He was down to earth, ambitious but not ruthless, and he seemed to care about her opinions. "I've been enjoying them too," she admitted. Their first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown. Derek was the perfect gentleman, opening doors and pulling out her chair. He asked her about her family, and Amelia gave him the story she'd prepared. Her parents had died when she was young, she'd worked her way through college, and she was just trying to build a simple, peaceful life. "I admire that," Derek said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "There's something so beautiful about someone who works hard and doesn't need all the flashy things in life to be happy." 6 months later, Derek proposed. It was simple and romantic, just the two of them on a picnic by the lake, with a ring that wasn't expensive but was chosen with care. Amelia said yes, thinking she'd finally found the peaceful life she'd been searching for. The wedding was small, held in the courthouse with just a few of Derek's friends and his sister Rebecca as witnesses. Rebecca was a stunning redhead who worked in fashion, and she seemed thrilled to welcome Amelia into the family. "Derek's told me so much about you," Rebecca said as she hugged Amelia after the ceremony. "He says you're exactly what he's been looking for, someone real, someone genuine. Not like those fake women who only care about money and status." Amelia felt tears in her eyes. After years of feeling like she could never escape her family's reputation and wealth, she'd found people who loved her just for being herself. Or so she thought. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Derek's business was doing well, and they bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Amelia continued her bookkeeping work, and they settled into a comfortable routine. Rebecca visited often, and the three of them would have dinner together and watch movies on weekends. But slowly things began to change. Derek started asking casual questions about her past, wondering if she had any family money tucked away or if her parents had left her anything. When Amelia insisted she had nothing, he seemed disappointed. Rebecca's visits became more frequent, and sometimes Amelia would come home to find them deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. They claimed they were just planning surprises for her or discussing Derek's business, but something felt off. The questions about money became more direct. Derek wondered why she was so careful with her finances if she really came from nothing. He started going through her mail, looking for bank statements or legal documents. When he found her savings account statements showing she'd managed to save a decent amount from her bookkeeping work, he became convinced she was hiding wealth from him. "Come on, Amelia," he said one night after they'd had an argument about money. "You can trust me. If your family left you something, even if it's not much, we should be planning for our future together." But there was nothing to tell. Amelia had left her father's world with only her clothes and her determination to start over. The money in her savings account came from working 60-hour weeks and living frugally. She had no trust fund, no inheritance waiting for her, no secret wealth. Derek didn't believe her. And neither did Rebecca. As their first anniversary approached, Amelia began to realize that the man she'd married and the life she'd built might not be what she thought they were. But she still had no idea just how wrong she'd been about everything. By the second year of their marriage, the mask was starting to slip. Derek had become increasingly frustrated with their modest lifestyle, making comments about friends who lived in bigger houses and drove better cars. He'd started working later hours, claiming his consulting business was expanding, but when Amelia offered to help with the books, he always had an excuse for why that wasn't necessary. Rebecca's visits had changed too. Instead of the warm, sisterly conversations they used to have, Rebecca now seemed to study Amelia with calculating eyes. She asked probing questions about Amelia's childhood, her education, and especially about any family connections she might have forgotten to mention. "It's just so unusual," Rebecca said one evening while Derek was taking a shower. They were sitting in the living room and Rebecca was drinking wine from one of their wedding gift glasses. "Most people remember something about their parents, even if they died young. Photos, family friends, relatives who stayed in touch." Amelia kept her expression neutral, but her heart was racing. "I was very young when they died. My memories are fuzzy." "But surely there were legal documents? Insurance policies? Something that would help you remember details about their lives." "Why are you so interested in my dead parents?" Amelia asked, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. Rebecca's smile was sharp. "I just think it's important for family to know about family. Derek deserves to know the whole truth about the woman he married." The conversation was interrupted by Derek returning to the room, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being investigated rather than loved. Things escalated a few weeks later when Amelia came home early from work with a migraine. She opened the front door quietly, planning to slip upstairs for some medicine, when she heard voices from the kitchen. Derek and Rebecca were talking in low, urgent tones. "Has to be more to it," Rebecca was saying. "Nobody just appears out of nowhere with perfect credentials and no past." "Maybe we're wrong about this," Derek replied, but he sounded frustrated rather than convinced. "Maybe she really is just what she says she is." "No way. Look at how she handles money, how she talks, the way she carries herself. That's not a woman who grew up poor and worked her way through college. That's someone who's had advantages." Amelia pressed herself against the wall, hardly breathing. "Even if you're right," Derek said, "what are we supposed to do about it? I can't exactly force her to admit she's been lying." "Can't you?" Rebecca's voice had taken on a cold tone that Amelia had never heard before. "She's your wife, Derek. Wives are supposed to share everything with their husbands. If she's hiding money or assets, you have a right to know. And if she's not? If we're wrong and she really doesn't have anything?" There was a long pause before Rebecca answered. "Then we cut our losses and find someone who does." Amelia felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. They weren't talking about a marriage anymore. They were talking about a business arrangement that wasn't profitable enough for their liking. She managed to slip upstairs without being heard, but that conversation changed everything. Over the next few weeks, she started paying closer attention to Derek and Rebecca's behavior, and what she saw made her sick. They went through her things when she was at work. She could tell because items in her dresser drawers were slightly out of place, and her desk had been searched. They checked her computer history and read her emails. Derek even started conversations with her clients, asking casual questions about how long they'd known her and whether she'd ever mentioned family money. The breaking point came when Amelia found Rebecca going through their bedroom closet while Derek distracted her downstairs. "Looking for something?" Amelia asked from the doorway. Rebecca didn't even look embarrassed. "Just borrowing a sweater. You don't mind, do you?" But Rebecca was holding one of Amelia's old photo albums, the one with pictures from her college graduation. In the photos, Amelia was wearing an expensive dress and jewelry that her father had bought for the occasion. There were also photos of her at various political events, always carefully positioned in the background but clearly part of the world she'd left behind. "These are interesting photos," Rebecca said, flipping through the pages. "You look very comfortable at these fancy events. Almost like you belong there." "Those were from college," Amelia said carefully. "I sometimes worked catering jobs at political events." Rebecca looked at her with open disbelief. "Catering. Right." She closed the album and set it back on the shelf. "You know, Amelia, lies have a way of catching up with people. Especially in a marriage. Derek trusts you completely, but trust is a fragile thing." After Rebecca left, Amelia sat on her bed and stared at the photo album. She'd kept it because it contained some of her last happy memories with Samuel, but now she realized it was evidence of the life she tried to leave behind. Evidence that Derek and Rebecca were clearly determined to uncover. That night, Derek tried a different approach. "Honey," he said as they got ready for bed, "I've been thinking about our future lately. Maybe it's time we started planning for bigger things. A better house, maybe starting a family." "We've talked about this," Amelia replied. "We're doing well, but we need to be realistic about our budget." Derek sat on the edge of the bed and took her hands. "But what if we didn't have to worry about budget? What if you have resources you haven't told me about?" There it was. The direct question she'd been dreading. "Derek, I've told you everything about my financial situation. What you see is what there is." His grip on her hands tightened slightly. "I want to believe that, Amelia. But Rebecca thinks you might be keeping secrets from me. She thinks you might have family money that you're not telling me about." "Rebecca thinks a lot of things that aren't true," Amelia said, pulling her hands away. "Why are you letting your sister question your wife's honesty?" Derek's expression hardened. "Because my wife has been giving me answers that don't add up. Because my wife acts like someone who's had advantages she claims she never had. Because my wife might be lying to me about who she really is." The accusation hung between them like a wall. Amelia realized that her marriage wasn't just troubled, it was over. Derek and Rebecca had decided she was hiding wealth from them, and they weren't going to stop until they either found it or destroyed her trying. What they didn't know was that they were right about one thing: she wasn't who she claimed to be. But they were wrong about what that meant. And they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The end came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, exactly 2 years after Samuel's death. Amelia had been working late at the office, trying to finish month-end books for 3 different clients. When she pulled into her driveway at nearly 10 o'clock, she noticed Derek's car wasn't there, which was odd since he'd said he had an early day. She used her key to enter through the front door, planning to grab a quick dinner and head straight to bed. The house was dark except for a soft glow coming from the living room. As she walked toward it, she heard something that made her freeze in place. Moaning. Soft gasps. The unmistakable sounds of 2 people being intimate. Amelia's first thought was that someone had broken into their house. Her second thought, the one that made her stomach drop, was much worse. She crept toward the living room, her heart pounding so hard she was sure whoever was inside would hear it. What she saw destroyed what was left of her marriage. Derek was on the couch with Rebecca, both of them naked and completely absorbed in each other. This wasn't the awkward fumbling of a new affair, it was clearly something that had been going on for a long time. They moved together like people who knew each other's bodies intimately. "God, I've missed you," Derek was saying between kisses. "Having to pretend with her is killing me." "Not much longer," Rebecca gasped. "Once we get her committed, we'll have access to everything. And if there's nothing, we'll at least be rid of her." Committed. The word hit Amelia like a physical blow. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning to have her declared mentally incompetent. "Are you sure Dr. Patterson will go along with this?" Derek asked. "He owes me favors," Rebecca replied. "A few sessions where Amelia seems confused and unstable, some medication to make sure she actually appears unstable, and he'll sign whatever papers we need." Amelia backed away from the doorway, her mind racing. She had to get out of the house before they discovered her, but she also needed to hear more of their plan. "What if she fights it?" Derek asked. "How can she fight it if she's having a mental breakdown?" Poor Derek, trying so hard to help his wife who's losing touch with reality. Who's going to question a husband who just wants to get his wife the help she needs? They were kissing again, but Rebecca pulled away after a moment. "Besides, once she's committed, her finances become your responsibility as her husband. If she's been hiding money, we'll find it. If she hasn't, we'll divorce her while she's incapacitated and you'll be free to find someone who actually has something to offer." Amelia felt sick. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated plan to destroy her life and steal everything she had. And the worst part was that they were doing it because they believed she was hiding wealth that didn't exist. She managed to slip out of the house without being heard and drove to a nearby diner to think. Sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she couldn't drink, Amelia tried to process what she'd learned. Derek and Rebecca were lovers, possibly had been long before Amelia met Derek. They'd targeted her specifically because they believed she had hidden wealth. When she couldn't produce money that didn't exist, they'd decided to have her committed so they could access her finances legally. And if that didn't work, they'd divorce her and move on to their next victim. Over the next few days, Amelia pretended everything was normal while gathering evidence. She installed a small recording device in the living room and captured several more conversations between Derek and Rebecca. She photographed documents they'd forged, medical records claiming she'd been behaving erratically, fake witness statements from people who claimed to have seen her acting unstable in public. The plan was more detailed than she'd imagined. Dr. Patterson, who Rebecca apparently knew from her previous relationships, would examine Amelia and recommend immediate psychiatric commitment. Derek had already prepared papers declaring himself her legal guardian during her treatment. They'd gained access to her bank accounts and were planning to drain them to pay for her care, while actually keeping the money for themselves. "She's been so paranoid lately," Derek told Rebecca during one conversation Amelia recorded. "Always thinking people are watching her or going through her things. It's perfect her actual suspicions will sound like delusions when Dr. Patterson examines her. And if she tries to claim we're having an affair, that'll just sound like more paranoid fantasies," Rebecca added. Poor woman, imagining her husband and sister-in-law are conspiring against her. They'd thought of everything. Except for one crucial detail. They still had no idea who Amelia really was. As she sat in her car outside the diner where she and Derek had met 3 years earlier, Amelia made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. "Daddy," she said when the familiar voice answered. "It's me. I need help." Justice Thomas Mitchell listened without interruption as his daughter explained what had happened. When she finished, there was a long silence. "Amelia," he said finally, "do you want to come home?" "No," she replied firmly. "I want to fight. But I can't do it as Amelia Brooks, the quiet bookkeeper they think they can destroy. I need to do it as your daughter." "Then that's exactly what we'll do." For the first time in days, Amelia smiled. Derek and Rebecca thought they were playing games with a helpless woman who had no resources and no connections. They were about to learn they'd chosen the wrong target. And the game was just beginning. 3 years earlier, before she became Amelia Brooks the bookkeeper, she had been Amelia Mitchell, one of the most promising young legal minds in the country. The daughter of Supreme Court Justice Thomas Mitchell, she'd grown up in a world where law and justice weren't just careers, they were callings. The Mitchell family lived in a historic mansion in Georgetown, where Amelia and her younger brother Samuel had been raised to understand that their privilege came with responsibility. Their father had worked his way from a small-town lawyer to the highest court in the land, and he'd never let them forget that their advantages were meant to be used in service of others. Amelia had excelled at everything she touched. Harvard Law School at 22, graduating summa cum laude. A Supreme Court clerkship with Justice Rebecca Hamilton. A position at one of the most prestigious law firms in D.C., where she specialized in constitutional law and civil rights cases. By 25, she was already being mentioned in legal journals as someone to watch. By 27, she'd argued 3 cases before the Supreme Court and won them all. Legal experts predicted she'd follow in her father's footsteps, possibly becoming the youngest female Supreme Court justice in history. But Samuel had struggled with their family's legacy. Where Amelia thrived under pressure, Samuel crumbled. The expectations, the constant media attention, the weight of their father's reputation, it had all been too much for him. He'd started drinking in college and never really stopped. He tried law school but dropped out after his first year. He'd attempted business school, then journalism, then graduate studies in political science. Nothing stuck. He couldn't find his place in a world where being Thomas Mitchell's son meant everyone expected greatness from him. Amelia had tried to help. She'd covered for him when he missed family events, made excuses when he showed up drunk to political functions, even paid for several stints in rehabilitation programs. But she'd been so focused on her own rising career that she hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. The night Samuel died, he'd been driving home from their father's 60th birthday celebration. It was a high-profile event attended by politicians, judges, and media figures. Samuel had been drinking throughout the evening, and Amelia had been too busy networking and celebrating their father's achievements to notice. When the call came at 2 in the morning, Amelia was in her apartment preparing for a case she was arguing the next day. Samuel's car had hit a tree on the George Washington Parkway. The impact had killed him instantly. The media coverage was brutal. Supreme Court Justice's son dies in DUI crash. Mitchell family tragedy raises questions about pressure on political children. The dark side of legal dynasty. But the worst part wasn't the public scrutiny. It was the private guilt that ate at Amelia every day. She'd been so focused on living up to their father's legacy that she'd failed to see her brother drowning under its weight. She'd chosen her career over her family, and Samuel had paid the price. The funeral was a circus. Photographers camped outside the church, reporters shouted questions at the family, and political figures gave speeches about Samuel that bore no resemblance to the troubled young man Amelia had loved. Even in death, Samuel couldn't escape being defined by their father's position. That's when Amelia made her decision. 3 weeks after the funeral, she walked into her law firm's senior partners meeting and resigned. She withdrew from the Supreme Court case she was scheduled to argue. She sold her Georgetown townhouse, donated most of her expensive clothes and jewelry to charity, and disappeared. "I can't do this anymore, Daddy," she told Justice Mitchell the night before she left. "I can't be your daughter in public. I can't be the next generation of the Mitchell legal legacy. I just want to be a normal person who doesn't have cameras following her to the grocery store." Justice Mitchell had been heartbroken, but he'd understood. "Take all the time you need," he'd said. "But remember, you can't run from who you are forever. And who you are is someone who has the power to help people." So Amelia Mitchell had legally changed her name back to her maiden name and moved to a small city where nobody knew about Supreme Court justices or legal dynasties. She'd found work as a bookkeeper, rented a modest apartment, and tried to build a life where she was just another person trying to get by. For 3 years it had worked. She'd found peace in the simple routine of balancing books and filing taxes. She'd dated a few people casually, made friends with her co-workers, and started to believe she could leave her old life behind permanently. Meeting Derek had seemed like the final piece of the puzzle. A kind, normal man who wanted a simple life with a simple woman. Someone who would love Amelia Brooks without caring about Amelia Mitchell's connections or achievements. Except Derek had never loved Amelia Brooks at all. He'd married her because he believed she was hiding wealth from the Mitchell family name. The irony was devastating. He'd been right about her deception but completely wrong about what it meant. Now, sitting in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 3 years, Amelia looked through the newspaper clippings her father had saved. Articles about her Supreme Court victories, profiles calling her a rising legal star, predictions about her future in constitutional law. "You were magnificent," Justice Mitchell said from the doorway. "I know why you left and I've never blamed you for it. But watching Derek and Rebecca try to destroy my daughter, that's not something I can let slide." Amelia turned to face him. Her father looked older than when she'd left, his hair completely gray now, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected jurists in the country. "I don't want revenge, Daddy. I want justice." "Good," he replied with a smile that reminded her of the man who'd taught her that law wasn't about winning, it was about making sure the right side won. "Because we're going to give you both." The next morning, Amelia called her old law firm. Within hours, she had a legal team that made Derek's attorney look like a small-town amateur. By afternoon, private investigators were documenting every aspect of Derek and Rebecca's fraud. By evening, criminal lawyers were reviewing evidence for potential charges. Derek and Rebecca thought they were playing games with a helpless bookkeeper. They were about to face one of the most formidable legal minds of her generation. And she was just getting started. While Derek and Rebecca continued their plan to have her committed, Amelia was quietly building a case that would destroy them both. Working with her father's connections, she assembled a legal team that read like a who's who of constitutional law and white-collar crime prosecution. Her lead attorney was Margaret Chin, a Harvard classmate who now ran the criminal defense division at one of DC's most prestigious firms. Her investigator was former FBI agent Robert Torres, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Her psychiatric expert was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, one of the country's leading forensic psychologists, who would counter any claims about Amelia's mental state. But Amelia's most valuable asset was her own legal training. 3 years away from the courtroom hadn't dulled her instincts, and her knowledge of constitutional law gave her insights that most divorce attorneys would never consider. "They've made several critical errors," she explained to her team during their first strategy meeting in her father's Georgetown study. "First, they're attempting to commit someone against their will based on fabricated evidence, which is both civil and criminal fraud. Second, they're planning to steal marital assets through false guardianship, which is felony theft. Third, they've been conducting their affair throughout the marriage, which affects asset division significantly. Margaret looked through the recorded conversations and forged documents. This is more than enough for criminal charges against both of them. But are you sure you want to go that route? Criminal proceedings will be public, and your identity will definitely come out. My identity's coming out anyway, Amelia replied. The question is whether it comes out because I'm a victim or because I'm someone who fought back. Over the next 2 weeks, while pretending to be the same quiet bookkeeper Derek thought he was manipulating, Amelia and her team gathered devastating evidence. Robert Torres discovered that Derek's consulting business was largely fictional. He had a few small clients, but most of his income came from Rebecca, who was being supported by a series of wealthy older men she'd been deceiving for years. Derek and Rebecca had been running romantic cons together for nearly a decade, targeting women they believed had hidden wealth. You're not their first victim, Robert explained during one of their evening meetings. I've identified at least 3 other women they targeted in different cities. They'd research their marks, Derek would court them while Rebecca played the supportive sister-in-law, they'd marry the woman, and then systematically drain her assets before disappearing. What happened to the other women? Amelia asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 of them were successfully committed to psychiatric facilities after Derek gained control of their finances. The third one killed herself after losing everything and being abandoned by everyone she thought loved her. Amelia felt sick. Derek and Rebecca weren't just thieves, they were predators who had destroyed lives without any remorse. Dr. Warren conducted her own evaluation of Amelia, documenting her perfect mental health and emotional stability. She also reviewed the fake medical records Dr. Patterson had prepared and identified multiple inconsistencies and fabrications. Their psychiatric evidence wouldn't hold up under any serious scrutiny, Dr. Warren explained. Dr. Patterson has been disciplined twice by the medical board for falsifying records in custody cases. His license is already under review. Meanwhile, Margaret's team discovered that Derek and Rebecca had made another crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Amelia Brooks, the bookkeeper, would be represented by a small-town divorce attorney who wouldn't know how to handle complex financial cases. They'd prepared for a simple divorce where they could overwhelm their opposition with fake documentation and emotional manipulation. They hadn't prepared for constitutional lawyers who specialized in complex litigation. Their entire strategy depends on you being isolated and helpless, Margaret pointed out. They've built their case around the assumption that you have no resources and no support system. When you show up with a legal team like this, their whole plan collapses. But Amelia wasn't satisfied with just winning the divorce. Derek and Rebecca had targeted her specifically because they thought she was vulnerable. They'd callously planned to destroy her mental health and steal her life savings. Even worse, they'd done it to other women and would continue doing it to future victims if they weren't stopped permanently. I want them prosecuted, she told Margaret. Both of them. Full criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, attempted theft, and anything else you can make stick. The federal prosecutor will definitely be interested, Margaret agreed. Crossing state lines to commit fraud makes this a federal case. And when they find out you're Justice Mitchell's daughter, they'll make this a priority. There was one more element to consider: the media attention. Once Amelia's identity came out, the story would be irresistible to reporters. Supreme Court Justice's daughter targeted by con artists. The woman who'd walked away from legal stardom fighting back against the people who tried to destroy her new life. We can try to control the narrative, Margaret suggested. Get ahead of the story with friendly reporters who'll focus on the criminal aspects rather than your personal life. No, Amelia said firmly. Let them write whatever they want. I'm done hiding from who I am. As the court date approached, Derek and Rebecca continued their plan, unaware that every move they made was being documented and recorded. They were so confident in their strategy that they never considered the possibility that their quiet bookkeeper wife might be more than she appeared. Dr. Patterson completed his fake evaluation and recommended immediate psychiatric commitment. Derek had Amelia's commitment papers prepared and ready to file. Rebecca had found their next target, a recently widowed real estate agent in Florida who appeared to have inherited significant assets. They thought they had everything under control. On the morning of the court hearing, Derek woke up excited about finally gaining access to what he still believed were Amelia's hidden assets. Rebecca had already packed her bags for Florida, planning to leave town immediately after the proceedings. Neither of them had bothered to research who Judge Coleman was or why he might recognize the name Mitchell. And neither of them had any idea that the quiet woman they'd underestimated for 3 years was about to become their worst nightmare. The morning of the divorce hearing arrived with gray skies and steady rain, which Derek took as a good omen for washing away his marriage to the woman who'd disappointed him so thoroughly. He dressed in his best suit and met Rebecca at her apartment, where they went over their strategy one final time. "Remember," Rebecca said, checking her makeup in the mirror, "she's been acting increasingly paranoid and unstable. You're the concerned husband who just wants to get her the help she needs." Derek nodded, straightening his tie. "And you're the worried sister-in-law who's witnessed her decline firsthand." They had their witnesses lined up: Dr. Patterson with his fabricated psychiatric evaluation, 3 people Rebecca had paid to claim they'd seen Amelia behaving erratically in public, and Derek's business associate who would testify that Amelia had made bizarre accusations about being followed and watched. Their lawyer, Mr. Harrison, met them at the courthouse steps. He was a local attorney who specialized in quick, messy divorces where emotions ran high and evidence was questionable. Derek had hired him specifically because he had a reputation for winning cases through aggressive tactics rather than careful legal work. "This should be straightforward," Harrison assured them. "Your wife's attorney is some old guy who handles simple divorce cases. We'll present our evidence of her mental instability, get her committed for evaluation, and once you have guardianship, we can sort out the finances." Inside the courthouse, Derek spotted Amelia sitting with her lawyer, Mr. Peterson. She looked exactly like she had every other day for the past 3 years, a quiet, modest woman in simple clothes, clutching a worn purse and looking slightly overwhelmed by the formal setting. But something felt different. Peterson kept checking his watch and looking toward the back of the courtroom as if he was waiting for something. And Amelia seemed calmer than Derek had expected, given that she was about to be blindsided by their accusations. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Coleman entered. Derek had requested Judge Coleman specifically because his research suggested the judge was tough on what the legal community called difficult wives, women who made unreasonable demands during divorce proceedings. He'd expected a stern older man who would be unsympathetic to Amelia's inevitable emotional breakdowns when confronted with their evidence. What he hadn't expected was for Judge Coleman to drop his files when he saw Amelia's face. The confusion in the courtroom was palpable. Derek exchanged worried glances with Rebecca while Mr. Harrison looked annoyed by the delay. Only Amelia seemed unsurprised by the judge's reaction. When Judge Coleman asked for Amelia's full name and learned that she was Amelia Mitchell, the daughter of Supreme Court Justice Thomas Mitchell, Derek felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. But even as he spoke, he could see the truth in Judge Coleman's recognition, in the way Amelia held herself with new confidence, in the sudden tension that had filled the courtroom. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess to review the case file, and during that time, Derek's world completely collapsed. Mr. Harrison was frantically making phone calls, trying to verify what they'd just learned. Rebecca had gone pale and was gripping Derek's arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his sleeve. But the worst moment came when Derek looked toward the back of the courtroom and saw who had entered during the recess. Margaret Chin, one of the most famous criminal defense attorneys in the country, was setting up at a table behind Amelia. With her were 2 other lawyers Derek recognized from newspaper articles about high-profile federal cases. Behind them sat a man with a notebook who looked like a federal prosecutor. "Derek," Rebecca whispered, "we need to get out of here." But it was too late. When Judge Coleman returned to his bench, he looked like a man who'd been reminded of just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Coleman said, "I've reviewed your client's petition for divorce and the accompanying request for psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Brooks. Given what we've learned about Mrs. Brooks' identity, I think we need to examine these requests more carefully." Harrison stood shakily. "Your Honor, regardless of Mrs. Brooks' family connections, the evidence of her mental instability remains valid." "Does it?" Judge Coleman's voice was sharp. "Dr. Patterson, please approach the bench." What followed was 20 minutes of the most humiliating legal examination Derek had ever witnessed. Judge Coleman and Margaret Chin systematically destroyed Dr. Patterson's fake evaluation, pointing out inconsistencies, questioning his methods, and revealing his history of disciplinary action by the medical board. "Dr. Patterson," Judge Coleman finally said, "are you seriously asking this court to believe that you conducted a thorough psychiatric evaluation of a woman without ever meeting her in person?" Dr. Patterson's face was bright red. The evaluation was based on reports from her husband and sister-in-law. Reports that you've presented as your own clinical observations," Margaret interjected. "Which would constitute medical fraud." The fake witnesses were next. Under cross-examination by Margaret's team, all 3 admitted they'd been paid by Rebecca to make false statements. One of them broke down and confessed that he'd never even met Amelia. Derek watched his carefully constructed plan disintegrate piece by piece. But the worst was yet to come. "Your Honor," Margaret said, standing with a folder full of documents, "my client would like to present evidence of systematic fraud and conspiracy committed by Mr. Brooks and Ms. Brooks against her over the course of their marriage." For the next hour, the courtroom listened to recorded conversations between Derek and Rebecca planning Amelia's commitment. They heard detailed discussions of how they planned to steal her assets and move on to their next victim. They learned about the other women Derek and Rebecca had destroyed, including one who had taken her own life. Derek felt like he was watching his life end in real time. Everything they'd said and done was being played back in open court, with federal prosecutors taking notes and Rebecca sobbing beside him. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Coleman said when the evidence presentation was complete, "do you understand that attempting to have your wife falsely committed constitutes criminal fraud?" Derek's lawyer was gone. Harrison had quietly packed up his briefcase and left during Margaret's presentation, apparently unwilling to be associated with what had become a criminal case. "Your Honor," Derek stammered, we thought she was hiding money from us. We thought she was lying about her family. So your solution was to destroy her life and steal her assets?" Judge Coleman's voice was cold with disgust. "Mr. Brooks, you and your sister targeted my colleague's daughter for financial gain. You attempted to have her illegally committed to a psychiatric facility. You forged medical documents and suborned perjury. You've confessed to similar crimes against other women." Derek looked around the courtroom desperately, but there was no escape from what he'd brought on himself. Judge Coleman continued, "I'm denying your petition for divorce and referring this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. Mrs. Brooks, would you like to pursue a counter-petition?" Amelia stood, and for the first time, Derek saw her as she really was, not the quiet bookkeeper he'd married, but one of the most formidable legal minds of her generation. "Yes, Your Honor. I would." Judge Coleman looked out over his courtroom with the expression of a man who had seen every type of human behavior cross his bench, but what he was witnessing still managed to surprise him. In 30 years as a judge, he had never seen such a complete reversal of fortune happen so quickly. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "or should I say Ms. Mitchell, would you like to explain to this court how we've arrived at this situation?" Amelia stood, and Derek could see that everything about her had changed. Her posture was straighter, her voice was clearer, and her eyes held a confidence that he'd never seen before. This wasn't the woman he'd married. This was someone else entirely. "Your Honor, 3 years ago I made the decision to leave my family's world and build a quiet life under a different name. I met Derek Brooks and believed I had found someone who would love me for who I was, not for my connections or family background." She gestured toward the evidence that Margaret had presented. "Instead, I discovered that Derek and his sister Rebecca had targeted me specifically because they believed I was hiding family wealth. They married me under false pretenses, conducted an affair throughout our marriage, and planned to have me falsely committed to a psychiatric facility so they could steal my assets." Judge Coleman nodded. "And you have evidence of this conspiracy?" "Extensive evidence, Your Honor. Recorded conversations, forged documents, and testimony from their previous victims." Derek felt like he was drowning. Every word Amelia spoke was destroying any hope he had of salvaging the situation. But worse than that was the realization that he'd never known his wife at all. "Your Honor," Derek said, standing desperately, "I admit that we made mistakes, but we never intended to harm anyone. We just thought." "Mr. Brooks," Judge Coleman interrupted, "you thought you could systematically defraud and abuse someone you believed was vulnerable and powerless. The fact that your victim turned out to be one of the most connected people in the legal community doesn't change the nature of your crimes." Rebecca had been silent throughout most of the proceedings, but now she stood as well. "Judge Coleman, surely you can see that this is just a misunderstanding. We're a family and families have disagreements." The look Judge Coleman gave Rebecca was one of complete disgust. "Ms. Brooks, I've just listened to recordings of you planning to drug your sister-in-law and have her committed to a psychiatric facility. You discussed moving on to your next victim in Florida. This isn't a family disagreement, this is a criminal conspiracy." He turned back to Amelia. "Ms. Mitchell, I knew your father when he was still practicing law in Maryland. I clerked for Judge Harrison when your father argued his first case before the circuit court. I've watched your father's career with great admiration, and I followed your legal career before you disappeared 3 years ago." Derek's heart sank further. Not only had he targeted the daughter of a Supreme Court justice, he targeted someone who had her own reputation in legal circles. "I remember reading about your Supreme Court victories," Judge Coleman continued. "You were being mentioned as a future justice yourself. What happened?" Amelia's voice was steady, but Derek could hear the pain underneath. My brother died in a car accident 2 years ago, Your Honor. The media attention and family pressure had become too much for him, and I blamed myself for not seeing how much he was struggling. I decided I needed to leave that world and try to be a normal person. And instead you found yourself targeted by people who wanted to exploit what they thought was your family wealth. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying Derek and Rebecca with open contempt. Mr. Brooks, Ms. Brooks, you've committed serious federal crimes. But more than that, you've targeted someone who was trying to heal from a family tragedy by building a simple, honest life. He looked at the federal prosecutor who had been taking notes throughout the proceedings. Mr. Williams, I assume your office will be pursuing charges? Federal Prosecutor Williams stood. Yes, Your Honor. We'll be filing charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft, falsification of medical records, and we're investigating similar crimes committed by the defendants in other jurisdictions. Derek felt his legs give out and he collapsed back into his chair. Federal charges. Multiple jurisdictions. His life was over. But Judge Coleman wasn't finished. Ms. Mitchell, what would you like to see happen in terms of the civil proceedings? Margaret stood. Your Honor, my client is filing for divorce based on adultery and fraud. She's also filing civil claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and fraud. We're seeking full restitution for all assets Mr. Brooks and Ms. Brooks attempted to steal, plus punitive damages. And the assets in question? Ms. Mitchell's savings from her bookkeeping work, which totals approximately $50,000. She has no trust fund, no inheritance, and no family money. The defendants targeted her based on a completely false assumption about her financial situation. Derek wanted to laugh at the irony, but he was too terrified. They'd risked everything to steal $50,000 from a woman who was connected to some of the most powerful people in the country. They'd destroyed their lives for a misunderstanding. Judge Coleman shook his head. So you attempted to destroy a woman's life and freedom to steal her modest savings, which you could have earned legitimately in a few months of honest work. Your Honor, Rebecca said desperately, we never meant for it to go this far. We just thought she was lying to us about her family background. She was lying about her family background, Judge Coleman replied. She was lying because she wanted to escape the pressure and publicity of being Supreme Court Justice Thomas Mitchell's daughter. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for her family connections. And you targeted her because you thought those connections meant money you could steal. He stood and everyone in the courtroom rose with him. This court finds clear evidence of systematic fraud and conspiracy. Mr. Brooks, your petition for divorce is denied. Ms. Mitchell's counter-petition is granted. All marital assets are awarded to Ms. Mitchell, and both defendants are ordered to pay restitution and damages in the amount to be determined at a later hearing. Derek's world was ending, but Judge Coleman wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm issuing restraining orders preventing either defendant from contacting Ms. Mitchell or approaching within 500 feet of her. Federal marshals will escort both defendants from this courthouse, where they will be taken into custody pending formal charges. As federal marshals moved toward them, Derek looked at Amelia one last time. She was standing with her legal team, looking like the accomplished lawyer she'd been before she tried to disappear into a simple life. She looked powerful, confident, and completely out of his reach. He'd married her thinking she was a prize he could claim and exploit. Instead, he'd awakened something in her that was going to destroy him completely. And he finally understood that he'd never deserved her at all. 6 months later, Derek Brooks sat in a federal holding facility wearing an orange jumpsuit and wondering how his life had gone so completely wrong. The trial had been a media circus, with reporters documenting every detail of how he and Rebecca had targeted the daughter of one of the country's most respected Supreme Court justices. The criminal charges had been devastating. Conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft by deception, falsification of medical records, mail fraud, and wire fraud. The prosecutors had thrown everything they could at them. When they'd investigated Derek and Rebecca's previous victims, they'd found evidence of similar schemes in 3 other states, adding additional federal charges. Rebecca had tried to make a deal by testifying against Derek, claiming he'd manipulated her into participating in the scheme. But the recordings Amelia had made clearly showed Rebecca as an equal partner in the conspiracy, often the one pushing for more aggressive tactics. Her attempt to betray Derek had only made her look worse to the jury. The civil trial had been even more humiliating. Amelia's legal team had systematically dismantled every aspect of Derek and Rebecca's lives, revealing their pattern of targeting vulnerable women and the devastating consequences for their victims. The jury had awarded Amelia not only full restitution but punitive damages that would keep Derek in debt for the rest of his life. But the worst part wasn't the prison sentence or the financial ruin. It was the complete destruction of his reputation and any chance of a future. The case had been covered by every major news outlet, with headlines like, "Con artists target Supreme Court Justice's daughter," and "The bookkeeper who fought back." Derek's photo was associated with one of the most despicable fraud schemes in recent memory. Rebecca had received a longer sentence than Derek, 12 years compared to his 8, because investigators had determined she was the mastermind behind multiple similar schemes. She'd used her connections in the fashion industry to identify and research potential victims, while Derek had been the face who courted and married them. Dr. Patterson had lost his medical license and received 5 years for medical fraud. The 3 witnesses who'd been paid to lie had received probation in exchange for their cooperation with federal investigators. Meanwhile, Derek had watched from prison as Amelia's life transformed completely. The media attention hadn't been the nightmare she'd feared when she first left her father's world. Instead, the story had been covered as an inspiring tale of someone who'd overcome personal tragedy and refused to be victimized by people who thought they could exploit her vulnerability. Legal journals had written articles about her decision to return to law after her 3-year absence, praising her for using her skills to protect herself and seek justice for other victims. Several law schools had invited her to speak about her experience, and she'd started a foundation to help victims of romantic fraud schemes. Most importantly, she'd found love again. Dr. Jonathan Hayes was a hospital administrator she'd met at a victims' rights conference where she'd been speaking. He was a kind, intelligent man who'd known exactly who she was from the beginning and had fallen in love with her strength and determination rather than her family connections. Their wedding announcement had run in the Washington Post 6 months after Derek's sentencing. The photo showed a radiant bride in an elegant but simple dress, surrounded by family and friends who clearly adored her. Justice Thomas Mitchell had walked his daughter down the aisle, and their reconciliation had been another positive outcome of the whole nightmare. Derek had seen the photos online during his limited computer time at the facility. Amelia looked genuinely happy in a way she never had during their marriage, and it was clear that Jonathan saw her as the remarkable woman she was rather than as a prize to be won or exploited. The final insult had come when Derek learned that Amelia was returning to legal practice. She joined a prestigious firm specializing in victims' rights and constitutional law, focusing on cases involving fraud and elder abuse. Her first major case had been representing the families of Derek and Rebecca's other victims, helping them recover damages and seek justice. She'd become everything Derek had tried to prevent her from being: powerful, connected, and absolutely untouchable. As Derek sat in his cell, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his court-appointed lawyer after his sentencing. "You targeted the wrong person," the lawyer had told him bluntly. "If you'd actually researched Amelia Mitchell instead of assuming she was hiding family money, you would have known that she gave up a legal career most people only dream about. You would have known that her family has connections throughout the legal system. You would have known that she was someone who could fight back. But she seemed so quiet," Derek had protested. "So normal." "She was quiet because she was grieving and trying to heal," the lawyer replied. "She was normal because she chose to be, not because she couldn't be anything else. And when you threatened her, she chose to be something else entirely." That was the truth Derek was finally beginning to understand. Amelia had never been the helpless victim he'd imagined. She'd been a powerful person who was choosing to live quietly, and when he tried to destroy her, she'd simply chosen to stop being quiet. The woman he'd married had been real, but she'd only been part of who Amelia Mitchell really was. And the part he'd never seen: the brilliant lawyer, the Supreme Court Justice's daughter, the woman with connections throughout the most powerful circles in the country, that was the part that had destroyed him. Rebecca was in a women's facility 2 states away, and from what Derek heard through the prison grapevine, she wasn't adjusting well to incarceration. Her looks and charm, which had helped her manipulate people for years, were worthless in an environment where respect had to be earned through character rather than deception. Neither of them would be eligible for parole for at least 6 years, and when they were released, they'd face a world where their names were synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal and exploitation. Derek closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be the confident man who'd walked into that coffee shop 3 years ago, certain he could charm and manipulate the quiet bookkeeper into giving him access to wealth he was sure she was hiding. That man seemed like a stranger now. And the woman he'd underestimated so completely was now someone he could only see in newspaper articles about legal victories and social justice causes. Justice had been served, completely and thoroughly. And Derek finally understood that he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. 1 year after the trial, Amelia stood in the conference room of Mitchell and Associates, the law firm she'd established with her father's blessing and financial backing. The walls were lined with law books and framed articles about their successful cases, but the atmosphere was warm and welcoming rather than intimidating. She was meeting with Sarah Chin, a 45-year-old teacher who'd been targeted by romance scammers online. The perpetrators had convinced Sarah they were wealthy businessmen overseas, and over the course of 8 months, they'd stolen her life savings and left her emotionally devastated. "I feel so stupid," Sarah was saying, tears in her eyes. "How could I fall for something like this? I'm an educated person. I teach high school students about being careful online." Amelia handed her a tissue and sat down across from her. "Sarah, you're not stupid. You're someone who was targeted by criminals who specialize in exploiting people's desire for love and companionship. What happened to you wasn't your fault. But I sent them money. I believed their stories about being stuck overseas or having frozen bank accounts. I ignored my family's warnings. Because they were experts at what they did," Amelia explained gently. "These scammers study psychology and emotional manipulation. They know exactly what to say to make someone trust them and want to help them." Sarah looked up hopefully. "Do you think we can get my money back?" "We're going to do everything possible to trace the funds and hold the perpetrators accountable," Amelia promised. "But more importantly, we're going to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." After Sarah left, Amelia sat in her office reviewing the case files that had accumulated over the past year. Her practice had grown quickly, with referrals coming from victim advocacy groups, law enforcement agencies, and other attorneys who recognized her unique expertise in fraud cases. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Mrs. Hayes? Your husband called. He's on his way to pick you up for dinner." Amelia smiled at the name. She'd kept Mitchell as her professional name but had taken Jonathan's last name personally, something that felt like reclaiming her right to choose her own identity. Jonathan arrived a few minutes later, looking handsome in his scrubs after finishing his shift at the hospital. He'd been working on implementing new protocols for identifying elderly patients who might be victims of financial abuse, and his passion for helping vulnerable people was one of the things Amelia loved most about him. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing her cheek as she gathered her things. "Good. I took on a new case, a teacher who was scammed out of her retirement savings. And I got a call from the prosecutor in Florida. They're going to use our documentation as a model for how to investigate romance fraud cases." Jonathan smiled proudly. "You're changing the world, one case at a time." As they drove to the restaurant, Amelia reflected on how much her life had changed. The quiet bookkeeper who'd walked into that courtroom a year ago felt like someone from another lifetime. She was still the same person at heart, but she'd reclaimed the strength and purpose that grief had made her forget. The restaurant was one of their favorites, a small place where they could talk quietly without being recognized or bothered. As they waited for their food, Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand. "I have some news," he said, grinning. "Good news, I hope?" "The hospital board approved my proposal for the financial abuse prevention program. We're going to start training all our staff to recognize signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation." Amelia felt a surge of pride and love. Jonathan understood that fighting injustice took many forms, and he'd found ways to make a difference through his work just as she had through hers. "That's wonderful," she said. "How many patients do you think it will help?" "Hundreds, maybe thousands over time. And hopefully, other hospitals will adopt similar programs." They talked about their work throughout dinner, sharing stories about difficult cases and small victories. It was the kind of conversation Amelia had never been able to have with Derek, who'd only been interested in immediate personal gain rather than making a positive impact on the world. After dinner, they walked through the park near their home, enjoying the warm evening air and the quiet companionship they'd found together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Derek and Rebecca hadn't tried to destroy you?" Jonathan asked. Amelia considered the question. "I think I would have stayed hidden forever. I was so afraid of becoming public again, of having to deal with the pressure and expectations that come with being my father's daughter. And now I realize that hiding from who I am wasn't protecting me, it was just limiting me. Derek and Rebecca forced me to remember that I have power and skills that can help people. In a strange way, they gave me my life back." They stopped at a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks were swimming in the fading light. Jonathan put his arm around Amelia and she leaned into his warmth. "I got a call from my father today," she said. "He wants me to consider applying for a federal judgeship when one opens up." Jonathan looked at her with interest. "What did you tell him?" "That I'll think about it. A year ago the idea would have terrified me. But now I think I could handle it." I know who I am and what I want to accomplish. Judge Amelia Hayes, Jonathan said, testing out the sound. I like it. Amelia laughed. Judge Mitchell Hayes, probably. I'd want to honor both our families. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks and enjoying the peace they'd built together. Amelia thought about Derek, probably lying in his prison cell, and Rebecca facing her own consequences for the choices they'd made. She didn't feel sorry for them, but she didn't hate them either. They'd been catalysts for changes that ultimately made her life better. Ready to go home? Jonathan asked as the sun finished setting. Yes, Amelia replied, standing and taking his hand. I'm ready. As they walked back to their house, a comfortable home where they hosted dinner parties for friends, worked on cases together, and planned for a future filled with purpose and love, Amelia realized that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for 3 years ago when she tried to disappear. Not escape from her identity, but integration of all the different parts of who she was. The Supreme Court Justice's daughter, the brilliant lawyer, the woman who'd survived betrayal, the advocate for victims, the wife who was loved for exactly who she was. Derek and Rebecca had tried to destroy her by exposing her secrets and exploiting what they saw as her weakness. Instead, they'd freed her to become the person she was always meant to be. And that person was someone who would spend the rest of her life making sure other victims got the justice they deserved.